College football nerds here talking Tennessee and Georgia. This is the game of the year so far in college football. I got Josh with me. We're going to get nerdy with y'all. We're going to talk about this game. Obviously, it's a huge one. A little bit of a programming note to get this one started. We did a hypothetical, and it was a lot of fun. It was completely silly, completely unserious. Iowa versus Texas A&M. You can maybe figure out why we would do that. It's dropping Wednesday. Keep an eye out for it. It's not going to pop up too much in the Google algorithm because nobody's searching for Iowa versus Texas A&M. But if you want to see us be a little bit punch drunk and a little bit unserious, you can check that one out. We did do a model for it, so it'll be interesting. Josh, this game is also interesting because we don't normally do this off the jump. We don't normally talk about Vegas and lines. We usually work it in later on down the line. This one was a pretty big number. Based on where you looked, it might have been around 10.5, maybe 9 in the open, and bought down pretty quickly. So, it's interesting for me, given both of these two teams and kind of where they are this year. I feel like there's a lot of questions still about both of these teams. And usually when there's questions, you don't have this confident of a number and this big of a spread for Vegas. So I want you to talk about two things. One, were you surprised that the number was as big as it was? And two, were you surprised that it was bought down that fast? And maybe what does that mean?
I was surprised by the big number. I really wasn't expecting this game to be more than a touchdown on either side. It really would not have surprised me if this number had come out with Tennessee being favored. Now, I didn't think they would be. I figured it'd be Georgia, but I figured it'd be Georgia by 2 or 3 points. From a practical perspective, anytime you see a margin get over a touchdown, usually it's saying a lot, right? It's not that hard to get within a score, even closing at the end of the game. It's kind of difficult to pace out a team that is, a shootout caliber team by this mark, because a lot of times you're kind of playing to the final possession. You end up in sort of onside kick territory. And yeah, I was surprised. Now, what was also interesting is that the number got bought down so quickly. And we talk a lot that when people talk Vegas and the public, a lot of times people think there's this idea that they try to balance money 50-50 on either side. I really don't think that's how it works, and I'm pretty confident it isn't. There are times when they try to balance it, and I think most games they're trying to sort of balance the results so that it's a 50-50 shot who wins. And I think if you look at the ATS results overall, you'll usually see it's like 49 to 51%. Incidentally, I think it's kind of funny. Gross models, sometimes they brag about their model beating Vegas or being under Vegas when they pick 400 games and they're like 1% off. You're just kind of in margin for error. But at that point, they're winning on juice. But I don't think that's really where they make their money. I think they make their money by giving trap bets, by trying to encourage you to pick a team that they think is going to lose, and giving Georgia, an 11, or giving Tennessee 11 points in this game or 9 points or wherever it was opening initially. That says a lot. That's kind of begging the public to take Tennessee in the points, which is suggesting that Vegas is pretty confident that they think Georgia is going to win the game. Obviously, it's a lot, but I know a 1 touchdown spread is comes out to about a 70% chance of winning. When it was more around 9 or 10%, they were saying it's more like 80, 85%. So they're saying that you could play this game 5 times and Tennessee wins 4 of them. Or Georgia wins 4 of them rather. That's a lot. That's a lot. So it did surprise me, and I just kind of want to throw out some of the context there because, yeah, it's a big number, and it's a big set of odds. And if you think it's a 50-50 game, even now, Vegas is saying Tennessee has no more than a 1 in 4 chance to win. And I just find that really surprising, frankly.
College Football Nerds has a sponsor for the 2022 college football season. It is Bird Dogs. You can check them out at birddogs.com. They make good-looking clothes for guys. And Josh, I recently went on vacation. It was in the Caribbean. My wife said you need to take a proper swimsuit. I didn't have any swimsuits, but I did have some Bird Dog shorts, and they are lined, so I say that counts as a proper swimsuit. I did use them to swim in the ocean, in the pool, but also could wear them around the cruise ship, and I felt like I looked a lot better than my fellow cruisers, at least the ones with the dad vibes, rocking the cargo shorts. And my wife approved, so okay, that's a good pass. But when I got home, had a little bit of a business trip, Had my Bird Dog pants with me too. No pleats, no box cut. Looked pretty clean. Had a nice fit. So felt good about that too. But Josh, I think you've had some similar experiences with Bird Dogs.
Well, Daniel, I'm a simple nerd. And as a simple nerd, I struggle with figuring out how to make myself look fashionable. And I found that Bird Dogs do a good job of it. I mean, I obviously, I'm a fine specimen, but some days, having something that you can trot out that looks nice and is comfortable to wear is great. And Bird Dogs is really good because they have a lot of clothes that are good for casual occasions, and they've got stuff that's good for a business casual office like I'm in. And I've got the Bird Dogs shorts here, and you can see, I mean, they're good. They've got liner. They come in a lot of colors and styles, some more or less flashy. You got pockets, even got a little zipper pocket for geeks like me, but they don't look like cargo shorts, right? And I am that dork that wore cargo shorts pretty much all the way through high school and college, and to grow up a little bit and wear something a little nicer is a nice change of pace.
So go to bergdogs.com, enter promo code NERDS. It was CFP Nerds, but now we're just going with Nerds because that's what we are. And they'll throw in a free Bird Dogs rope hat. That's bergdogs.com, promo code NERDS, and boom, free Bird Dogs rope hat with your pair of Bird Dogs. The most comfortable shorts, pants, sweatpants with built-in liners. You're not going to want to take these things off, I promise. And guys, we don't do a lot of asks from y'all. We don't do Patreon or anything like that, not even any merch yet. But one thing we do ask is when we have somebody that supports the channel, you support them as well. That's birddogs.com, promo code NERDS. Yeah, and I think that for us, it really comes down to, and just full disclosure, I've got Tennessee number 1 in my rankings this week. That doesn't even mean I'm going to pick them in this game, but in terms of what they've done to date and how they've looked, what I said in a live show is best, probably best win. I think that Georgia over Oregon is the most dominant win over a good team, but beating Alabama is probably the best win so far this year. And then Tennessee was dominant over Kentucky. They've been dominant this year. Josh, what I don't understand about this number, and we're not just focused on Vegas, but it really kind of speaks to how we feel out this game. To me, there's a lot of baked-in questions about both of these teams, and we're trying to suss out whether or not Tennessee is like a 2019 LSU. I'm not saying they're that good, but a 2019 LSU, 2014 Ohio State, in that they start off a little rocky. And what I said, again, in the live show was Tennessee might be 2014 Ohio State, where they started off rocky, and they just didn't have the loss to Virginia Tech. Instead, it was overtime with Pitt. And then they got really good throughout the end of the year. 2019 LSU really struggled with Texas, almost lost that game, ended up being, a force to be reckoned with by the end of the year. What Vegas is telling me right now is we're in week 10, and they don't think that that's who this Tennessee team is, because we've seen enough from Georgia to know that they've got some issues too. Everybody does. That's not a knock on Georgia. This year, there's just a little more parity at the top. But Josh, to me, and this is the next thing I want you to talk on, this is hard for me because I'm kind of surprised in week 10, these two teams only have one common opponent and they play in the same division. And so for me, I've expected this number to be a little closer because there's all these questions, because we don't have a lot of transitive property data to see how they compare in terms of matchups and things like that. So talk about that a little bit, and maybe we can talk about the Florida game and how that went for both teams. But have you seen enough to be comfortable that Georgia would win this game by, nearly double digits?
I don't think I've seen enough to be comfortable on it, but this also gets into the reality that when the scoring potential is this high, it may be that it's not that hard for them to cross that, touchdown point margin. And this gets into sort of the screwiness with point spreads and how you evaluate them and win percentage and all that. And I think sometimes we take these things for more of an absolute metric than they are. And what I mean by that is, I could see this being a game where Vegas is saying, look, there's a 50% shot that Georgia wins by 2+ touchdowns, and there's a 50% shot that Georgia loses or wins by a very small margin. And then maybe they see, I've said this a lot, right? Like, it may be that 9 points is your median outcome in Vegas's mind, right? If you play 10 times, the middlemost outcome is 9 points, but it may be that Georgia loses 4, wins 4 by 20, and then has an 11-point game the other 2 times. And so, yeah, there's a big difference in a game that's, if you're expecting to be, Texas A&M Iowa, right? And you had that being a 9-point margin. That means you really think one of those teams is probably better than the other, because that's a lot of points. And in this one, I don't think it is. And so I first I want to take a step back and say, I think sometimes we try to draw just general conclusions, because you can look at win percentages for a given spread, but you have to remember in college football, the way teams play is so different that we can talk about a lot of things with that, but spreads is one. I think also the whole idea of going for it on fourth down at a high clip like people do, I personally don't buy the math behind it. I could go into a lot more detail on it, but the reality is, if you look at the large term metrics on when people went for it on fourth down, well, people only go for it on fourth down when historically, when they thought they had a chance to get it. Or they were desperate. But certainly when a team was leading and they went for it on fourth down, they were extremely confident in their offense, which means they were probably a team that's more likely to convert, which means you probably have bad data, because the data is sort of self-biased. And there's a lot of junk that gets thrown in that comes out of the fact that you've got teams that play very different styles of football, teams that play different tempos, teams that are going to be high-scoring, low-scoring games. And we know these are good offenses, not bad offenses, and I think that sort of shifts it all. So that's a mouthful. I feel like you asked me a million questions, so let's try to unpack it from there. And I'll go to the maybe the first piece of it, and I think that's maybe the Florida games for both teams. The Georgia-Florida game in particular, 42-20, was a game where Florida made it a one-possession game late in the game in the fourth quarter, but they were never really in a major threat to win the game, I felt like. They were consistently sort of in a trailing position. They did not move the ball well. Now, I think Richardson's injury at the start of the game crippled Florida to an extreme extent in the first half. I don't know what kind of magic juice they gave him at halftime. The reality is they probably did give him a shot of something. In the second half, they came out running him, and they looked like a completely different team. Their run game opened up because dealing with Richardson as a runner really strains your defense schematically. You've got to commit linebackers to him. You have to keep containment on the edges, which means you can't really keep guys inside, and all of a sudden now you're giving up big interior runs. And that, I think there's almost a tale of two halves. When you look at the final stats, it's not maybe as accurate as it should be. But, that original Florida-Tennessee game, Florida made Tennessee look silly on the defensive side. And yeah, it took a lot for Florida to stay in that game, and that was a game that you've pointed out a lot, and I'll let you talk on that maybe Tennessee should have won by a larger margin. But Florida did move the ball very well on Tennessee through the air, or at least moved it pretty well, with a quarterback that hasn't been able to throw on anybody else. So one of the big questions here is, how much of that was a bit of an aberration? Was that an aberration in that Florida shouldn't have been in the game? Or was that an indication that Tennessee's defense really isn't very good, and we're taking maybe too much from Kentucky when Kentucky sort of self-imploded, right? Levis throws 3 interceptions. He's a guy that's been prone to have absolute head case nights, had 98 yards passing. Their right tackle was abysmal in that game. I felt like they couldn't protect Levis to save their lives. Maybe that was a game where Kentucky just imploded, given Alabama, Florida, a lot of other teams have thrown the ball on Tennessee. So I'm kind of curious for your thoughts on that. I mean, how do you evaluate the two Florida games between them? And do you think Tennessee is a team that's come around in terms of pass defense, or is that a little bit of a mirage coming out of that one game against Kentucky?
So I've never been sold on Kentucky's pass defense, but I do think that Tennessee's run defense, I've been on this all year, they're legit. And we've got another signal in this Kentucky game with Rodriguez back, and Kentucky couldn't run the ball. And Tennessee's run defense, and we're going to get into this in the model in a little bit, Tennessee's run defense is better than Georgia's on paper. They've faced more good run teams and have shut them all down. Florida and Alabama have traded spots at number one as rushing offenses in the country at different times throughout the year, and Tennessee shut them both down. Didn't shut them down entirely, but 50% of their averages or whatever.
Yeah, Florida had 3.4 yards per carry on Tennessee. Alabama had 3.7. And I can tell you offhand, because I was kind of looking at this, those numbers are kind of crazy for both teams. I mean, Alabama's had a couple games where they couldn't run due to various situations, but Tennessee was the second lowest mark of the year. The only one worse was the Mississippi State game in that last week, and I'm not.
They weren't
I
running
don't
their
know if
offense in that game like that. That I don't think that's a real reflection of Alabama's
Well,
run game.
and they also had Gibbs went out injured in that game, and I think McClellan was hurt in that game too. So I'm not sure how much you want to say, but to that, no one had held Alabama under 5.5 yards a carry at all, and that included Texas A&M and Texas. Even in those games where they didn't look great, Alabama actually averaged over 5 yards a carry in both of those games, and Tennessee held them to about 3.5. So between that and the Florida game, I mean, they're legitimately outperforming some really good defenses, and it's not just a total yardage thing, right? It isn't just that Alabama's passing. If Alabama passing really well, should mean that Tennessee can't stop the run because they're being strained by the pass, and they still stop the run on a per play sense.
Yeah, and I think that so the passing numbers though do concern me, and the Florida Georgia, it's we talk about emotion sometimes here, and I do think the Tennessee Florida game. Tennessee was leading that game by 17 points with 5 minutes left to go. Florida caught fire. They were playing against prevent, all of that, and it was closer in the end than Tennessee wanted to be comfortable. But that was also a huge emotional hump for Tennessee to beat Florida at Neyland Stadium, whereas Georgia beating Florida, no offense to Florida fans, is just no big deal, right? So there wasn't this emotional thing. They came out firing, and you're right, they were never in any scare there. The question and this might lead you into the model. The one thing standing out to me that's keeping me from saying, honestly, Tennessee slam dunk, because Georgia's run defense has shown that they can be run on. And Georgia fans, don't get mad. Like, this is just who you are this year. You got a great pass defense, really great pass defense. That run defense, it can be run on, I think, a little bit, because they face teams that can't throw the ball like Missouri, who are still able to run it. The thing that concerns me is Anthony Richardson has 3 career passing games over 200 yards. The number 2 game, his second best passing game ever, was against Georgia last week. I think he threw for like 270, 250, something like that, 7.1 yards per attempt. His number 1 best passing game ever was 453, if I remember correctly, against Tennessee. Again, some of that was prevent and all that, but this guy has only thrown 200 yards plus 3 times in his life. And one of them stands out among all others. And Bryce Young went absolute ham against Tennessee in a way that Georgia likes to play, because Bryce wasn't throwing 80-yard bombs. It was an efficiency game, which leads me into the model for you, because Georgia is an efficiency offense, and maybe it's going to show us something where Georgia's going to be able to attack Tennessee or vice versa.
Yeah, so trying to break down the model a little bit, it's interesting, right? Because the model, just say it square up, has these teams dead even from a scoring perspective, but they arrive at that score from very different ways. It's 25 all. Georgia is favored to outgain Tennessee 6.4 yards per play to 5.7. Why is that? Well, Tennessee has a better offense, and particularly Tennessee throws the ball better. 10.9 yards per attempt is a pretty crazy number. That's the LSU, Alabama, Ohio State sort of numbers when they were elite. But Georgia's pass defense is a lot better than Tennessee's pass defense, 78% to 94%. So it basically averages out the two passing teams. It's important to remember that Georgia is a very good offense. Despite even their stutters, from a per-play perspective, they've been very good. Their problem has been consistency, which I'll touch on in a second. The other interesting thing is, from a rush defense perspective, Georgia is holding teams to closer to Tennessee holds teams to fewer yards compared to their average than Georgia does. In terms of opponent rushing averages, they're actually pretty similar. Both teams have played teams that average about around 4.5 yards a carry. Actually, pretty good overall. I would say Tennessee's competition's been a little more sporadic. They've played some better teams and they've played some worse ones. Georgia's have been a little more consistent. But the problem is that Tennessee, even against teams that have been really good, like we talk about Alabama and Florida, they've held those teams to really low numbers. And so it all kind of balances out, right? Georgia's run offense is a little better. Tennessee's run defense is a little better. So the run games end up being pretty similar. Similar deal in reverse against the pass. Tennessee's pass offense is better, but Georgia's pass defense is a little better. It does end up coming out in Georgia's favor because really it's that pass defensive statistic that really clamps down Tennessee's offense. And there's also another wrinkle here that I don't think many people understand, right? You probably know this, but how many people do you think realize, Daniel, that Georgia is the team that passes more than they run, and Tennessee is the team that runs more than they pass? I mean, do you think that's a commonly known fact?
No, everybody would think it's the opposite, especially based on where Georgia's been lately. But I saw it in the numbers earlier today when I was putting together some graphics for the show, but I was kind of surprised. But then when I think about it, like, it makes sense. But I do wonder, Josh, and this is going to be the theme for the rest of this discussion for me, is it possible that Georgia's been holding back a little bit this year in terms of overall scheme and how they play the game because of the opponents they faced so far?
I mean, there's an argument for it. The interesting thing with Tennessee is outside that Pitt game, they haven't been challenged too much, right? Like they, especially in recent weeks, and I mean that on the offensive side of the ball. And against Alabama, they did pretty much whatever they wanted.
But they had but wouldn't you agree that against Alabama, against Florida, they weren't like holding back the playbook for Georgia? They yes, they scored a lot on Alabama, but they also put their entire offense on film for Georgia to review. I'm not convinced that Georgia has put their entire offense on film for Tennessee to review.
Okay, I think there's an argument there. People point to the Kent State game, they point to the Missouri game, and we've talked about this a lot between each other. Georgia has a couple things that really, I think, screw people up when they try to look at them statistically. One is they don't play very long games, and as a result of that, they don't score as many points as other teams because there's not as many possessions in the game. That doesn't mean your offense is ineffective, right? If Tennessee runs tempo, which they're going to do, that means they're going to hand the ball back to Georgia more. And if Georgia can run the ball with the kind of efficiency they have and throw it with the efficiency they normally have, they're going to extend long drives. And two things is going to happen. Either Georgia's going to score a lot of points, or Tennessee's not going to get the ball nearly as much as they're used to, and it's going to frustrate the offense. But I do think even in those, the Kent State, Missouri games, they really were never in too much threat of losing. Like the Kent State game was a 2-possession game in the second quarter, never relented. They just couldn't really put them away. Missouri was a similar deal. They closed right at the end, and then Georgia pulled away again. But they really haven't been in any situation where I felt like they would have been overly threatened. They've probably been comfortable to do what they want to do. And I mean, I see your point. I don't know that Georgia has really had to flex outside the opener against Oregon. And that reminds me a lot of some of the better Alabama teams that would just demolish somebody out of the gate, and then they kind of go to sleep until about November, and then they would come out and the offense would show up again. And I think to some degree they just kind of worked on crap they wanted to work on. And I say that because those are teams that Smart was on, and he was part of those coaching staffs and part of those decisions. So I do think that argument. Is certainly there, or at least it can't be. Can't be discounted. And I'll throw one more stat out here, and this is an interesting part in reverse, right? Against Kentucky last week, Tennessee was kind of gifted a situation where Levis threw them three interceptions, and they were able to win that game running the ball 40 times and passing it 25. Even against Alabama, which they won through the air, they did run it 39 times, they passed 30. Is it viable to play Georgia with that same scheme? I mean, if that is who Tennessee is, if they need to be, the numbers are about 4-3 run to pass, actually. And their whole deal is they have all those wide splits and they throw vertically, but the only reason they do that is that they throw the ball down the field after they run at you up enough at the middle where your safeties come down, and they've got the ability to throw down the field. Do you think there's something there where Georgia is going to be able to look at film and do something about it? I mean, is there a scheme issue where maybe Georgia's personnel presents a unique challenge? Is there something Georgia can do from a strategy perspective? Because I say that to say, does this really matter that they've put stuff on film? Because if that is who Tennessee is and nobody's got it figured out and you don't have an answer, you don't have an answer. It's only going to matter if there's aspects to that Georgia has a way to counter.
Well, and we don't know yet, right? Because there's the whole thing of like you can't stop it in the moment. Alabama couldn't adjust, and they've been really bad at defensive and offensive adjustments for a couple of years now. But I said this, I think, on Twitter a couple of days ago, and talking about Tennessee. There's one line of thought I have with Tennessee that is just because they might not, like if they played Alabama again tomorrow, I don't think they score 52. But that doesn't mean they can't beat Alabama 35-31, right? Like that whole thing is also at play. I think Alabama matched their cadence in terms of scoring and never adjusted to how Tennessee was doing things. But I also don't think that Tennessee, like if you put a gun to my head and said, what is more likely outcome? One of these two things is going to happen. If Alabama plays Tennessee again on a neutral field, either Tennessee's going to score 52 again or they're going to score 32. I think everybody's picking 32. That doesn't mean Tennessee loses that game. So I say all that to say, if there's we talk about teams that can't adjust to Tennessee because they're a behemoth. The only 2 teams, 3 teams, 4 teams in the country that can would be Alabama, Michigan, Ohio State, like those teams. Georgia is one of those teams that's going to take this film and not put a thumper safety on over, Hyatt. Like that's not going to happen. Alabama had that the entire game. And that's why he got just absolutely cooked the entire game. Georgia's going to adjust to that game plan a little bit, but they're still going to give up points. The question I have is, okay, in my thinking, I don't think that Georgia's going to give up 52 points to Tennessee. I think they're going to figure some things out schematically to where they might keep Tennessee in the 30s. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Tennessee loses the game. That's, I think, a very interesting thing to talk about. I know we're running late, but I want to put this back to you before we make our picks. One of the things that Georgia has struggled with all year and that has kept opponents in games is turnovers. At some point, because Georgia fans explain this away to us and say, yeah, if it wasn't for turnovers in Kent State, we'd kill them. If it wasn't for turnovers against Missouri, we'd kill them. At some point, that becomes part of who you are. You're just a team that turns the ball over. Like this year, Alabama's a team that doesn't force turnovers, right? So, Josh, I'm going to lead you into your pick, and I want you to talk about this because I think we need to consider it. I don't know what your score is going to be, but in considering your score and in considering what I know that Georgia's defense is going to be able to adjust in a way that Alabama couldn't at halftime, is there something in the back of your head that still says, okay, but maybe Georgia, because of turnovers and missed opportunities, isn't going to score 49 like Alabama?
I think that's the question, and I think it's the difficulty in picking this game. And I'll say up front, Tennessee offensively is so good that they create a lot of stress on you. But Tennessee's defense isn't so good that they can just roll you over the way some of those dominant, 2019 LSU is an example. Their talent level defensively was actually very high. They had guys like Queen that went very high in the draft. It took them a long time to get their act together, but they had crazy talent on that roster. I don't think Tennessee does. Their back end of the defense is filled with guys that are Georgia Tech transfer, Alabama transfer. Some of those guys didn't start on the prior teams. And they've kind of put stuff together, and they found something in Young on the defensive line that's given them the ability to rush the passer and get some disruption. I think that's been kind of the key. But they are very much, I would say 2010 Auburn, like the Nick Fairley situation, where that's what Brian Young is for them. And outside that, they're pretty similar in that they're not a very NFL-laden roster defensively, but they've kind of got things together enough to play decent enough football to get some stops, and they play to disrupt. They play for interceptions. And something that really struck me in that Kentucky game is they play so aggressive at the line of scrimmage, crashing down on screens and things, because they know they can score points. And that's, it's sort of a double-edged sword going into this Georgia game because, Tennessee is 10th in the country in turnover margin. Georgia is 68th. And what that does is that if you've got an offense that can score points, then you don't have to worry about giving up a cheap touchdown because you think your offense is going to score anyway. And then you get more aggressive. So that allows you to disrupt plays, to get turnovers, and that can kind of pile up on an opposing team. Georgia has been susceptible to it, but I also think Georgia's been susceptible to it when they sleepwalk. In general, when they're most of their games, people just don't notice. They don't see how it's going, and they just score at will. And to lead into my pick, I'm going to give you the thing that I think is the most underrated statistic between these two teams, and that's offensive points per drive. So Brian Fremeau, that bcftoys.com, he runs FEI, has some really interesting statistics on that bcftoys.com website, one of which is offensive points per drive. So he looks at, I think he actually filters out, in fact, I know he does, he filters out garbage time from this, and he just looks at meaningful football time, how many points per possession is each team scoring. Georgia and Tennessee are fourth and second. And you want to know how close they are? Georgia scores 3.92 points per drive. Tennessee scores 3.95. 0.03 points per drive different. For all the perception of scoring and offensive production, the reality is Tennessee scores more because they play more drives, because they play at more tempo. That allows the other team also to have more drives, to score more points, play more tempo. But the difference here is really slim. When you get down to play, how likely Georgia is to score on a drive versus Tennessee, the difference is tiny. It's tiny. Now, our model doesn't love the numbers because it notes the fact that explosiveness is generally more productive. It's also picking up the fact that Georgia's had a lot of wasted possessions due to turnovers and that kind of thing. But I think a lot of that has been luck, and the turnovers have come in games where I don't think Georgia was very focused against teams that I don't think they were really worried about losing to. They've had a lot of fumbles, like fumbles from receivers and stuff like that in those games. I don't think they're all that likely to be repeated. But, on the defensive side of the ball, Georgia's third in the country in defensive points per drive allowed. Tennessee's 29th. They're not just giving up points because of tempo. Their defense is better than people think. It's still top 30 defense in this regard, but it's still not great. So, yeah, at the end of the day, I think Tennessee is a team that is absolutely capable of beating Georgia. They are on a roll. They remind me of 2012 Texas A&M going into that Alabama game. But I think people forget, too, that at the end of that Alabama game, I went back and looked at it. Alabama came back, and they had four plays at the end of the game to score to win, and they failed to do that. And then they jumped off sides in a punt and ended up letting Texas A&M win the game and kneel the clock out. There's a pretty good chance they lose that one. And Texas A&M also was coming in like 8+ yards per play, and they averaged about 5.5 in that game. They just kind of shell-shocked them in the first quarter. Georgia's not going to get shell-shocked. They know what Tennessee is. They know how hyped they are. Georgia is offensively as likely to score as Tennessee. They're not as explosive. They're way more efficient. I'm going to take Georgia by about 7. I'm going to say 37-30 Georgia, just to pick a random score. You're laughing, so that usually means we pick the same score, which happens way too often. And you guys probably all think we're making it up when we do it because the scores are so random. But that's where I'm at with it, and it really just comes down to the fact that I think Georgia's offense is grossly underrated. I think they're very efficient, and I think they're going to have long, sustained drives that's going to frustrate Tennessee. It's going to take away a lot of the advantages Tennessee holds where they're, playing at high tempo. And I'll say again, that even in that Kentucky game, they did well, but 245 yards on 25 attempts from Hooker was 3 touchdowns, but it wasn't crazy yardage. They didn't run the ball for 4 yards a carry. They had 177 yards rushing, but on 40 carries. And I say 4 yards a carry, but from the main backs. They had a big long one from Wright. I think Georgia has a better defensive line than Alabama by a long shot. Alabama's outside linebackers give them a big edge in pass rush versus a lot of teams, though they're kind of stupidly taking them out of the game schematically. Georgia's actual D linemen are better. I think Georgia can play more physical ball with fewer guys in the box than Alabama can. I think that's going to take away the run from Tennessee. Not going to let them score 50, and I think they're going to struggle a lot more with the sustained efficiency of Georgia, and I think that's probably going to lead Georgia to win, but I don't think it's going to lead them to win that comfortably. It won't shock me if they do. It won't shock me if it actually breaks down for Tennessee because there's a danger of it. But that's my long-winded explanation, but that's my pick for the game.
Yeah, and I want to open mine by saying we totally whiffed on Kentucky, Tennessee. Like, I want to own that.
That's true.
I want to completely
true.
own that, because Tennessee fans got at us in the comments, and they were right. Like, we missed that one, and what frustrates me about us missing it is neither one of us were that high on Kentucky. So we should have, been a little better there. I think so. I've got 37-31 Georgia, but there's two reasons why, and one is Tennessee on the road. So they struggled at Pitt, and LSU was over before it started, with their entire offensive line basically being, out of commission. That doesn't take away from that win. It just means I think it was a day game. Like, there's a little different scenario than playing Georgia on the road. Like, that's a tough ask. And I also think that Georgia has been throwing the ball a lot, just kind of fine-tuning things, not really showing much because they haven't had to. And that's not really fair to Tennessee, because Tennessee had to play Alabama. They had to open up at Pitt and kind of earn that win. But I think Georgia is about the same team as Tennessee. Completely different styles, different approaches, but in terms of overall quality and likely to beat an elite team, I think they're about the same, but this game's on the road. And I think that if these two teams rematched in the playoffs, it'd be a lot different story, because Tennessee would know how Georgia was going to play them. The only thing that's in the back of my mind, this is, they keep sticking at me, and this is why I'm struggling a little bit. We've seen Stetson Bennett have a little bit of a fall to earth this year. You noted they're throwing the ball a lot more. He's gone from a almost 11-yard per attempt guy to an 8-something yard per attempt guy, which is where he was 2 years ago. If they can't run the ball because Tennessee's run defense is legit, and they can pressure Stetson Bennett, we've seen him not perform well in those types of scenarios. And we've also seen him, like 2020 Alabama, I think it was, not perform well when he's got to dig himself out of a hole. Even last year against Alabama in the SEC championship game, when he's got to dig himself out of a hole. So I could see, if Tennessee got up early and kind of shocked them, that this could be bad news bears for Georgia. But I also think that Georgia's defense is going to shock Tennessee in a way that nobody's been able to do this year, because they're equipped and because they can maybe not have, like Alabama's not playing a corner that started in that game. Terrion Arnold is not playing anymore. Georgia doesn't have that problem. So that's, we're running long on this one, but that's it for me. 37-30, 37-31 for me and you. Josh, give me one kind of 30-second parting shot on if Tennessee does win this game, what's that score going to look like?
I think if Tennessee wins the game, they're probably going to score 40 plus. They're going to have to show that they're one of those teams that's able to score 40 plus on anybody. It's a rhetoric we started a few years ago, really hammered it in 2020, especially leading into that Georgia-Alabama game. My concern this year is I don't know. It feels like last year, especially into this year, defenses have found ways to adjust to the RPO, and nobody can quite do that anymore. Everybody, Ohio State this year with just crazy talent, is getting slowed down. And it used to be that no matter how good your talent was, if you weren't executing, you could get slowed down by a good defense. But it's been sort of in a state that high talent, high speed teams get isolation, and they have such easy isolation plays and easy completions that they would just explode on you. But it may be that no one just has the offense that Tennessee has, or has teams that execute at that level. And it may be that this scheme, I'm starting to wonder if it's, the RPO slant thing was in the middle of the field. By attacking wide, what everybody's done is they're taking outside linebackers and safeties and sort of moving them around, hybrid linebackers that cover from the line of scrimmage out. And what they've done is they've just moved the pass routes from here to here. So these linebackers that are attacking this part of the field, trying to take away those routes, can't actually help deep. And so you have the same RPO advantages that's sort of disrupting the schemes that's taken away everybody else's RPO game. So I think if they win, they're going to be in the 40s. And I also think Hyatt, it's not just that Hyatt stepped into Tillman's role. I think Hyatt is actually that good. He was a 200-something yard guy last year, and I think he's just exploded on the scene. And if they win big, I think you're going to see another 150-plus yard day from Hyatt, and he's going to start having the same sort of Heisman conversations that Devonta Smith had, and quite frankly, I think it's going to be deserved. And I think we all still haven't quite collectively figured out how good he was, and that he may also be the answer to why they struggled early in the year, because they didn't know quite what they had and how much they needed to rely on him.
All right, y'all, that is it for us. This is a long one. We try to go 20 minutes, and because the YouTube algorithm doesn't like long videos, which means we're going to need y'all's help. And if you've made it this far, I think you're just the candidate for that. Share us where you talk football. If it's on a forum, if it's on Facebook, help us out. Share it there. A couple other things. We need your score prediction in the comments. We need you to like and subscribe this video. And also, y'all, we're going to talk about this one. Saturday night, live show. We do it every week, and this is the game of the week. That's why we went so long. It's just this. There's a lot to talk about. Not game of the week. This is the game of the year in college football, Georgia, Tennessee. So excited to watch this one with y'all. Thanks so much for hanging out this long. Have a good week, and God bless.